Before we begin, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Jessica Rumbolt. I'm the manager of Indigenous Initiatives, and I'm grateful to be here with the team today, Kara, Jolene, and Denise, who will also be participating in asking the questions we have for Denise today. So before we begin and start to begin our conversation and engage with Denise about a really great, the work that she's doing, the work that they've done at George Brown, their experiences in education, and their hopes for the future of education as well. I'd like to first begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Today's event is put on by Indigenous Initiatives at George Brown. We welcome all students, employees, alumni, and community members to this space. The Indigenous Initiatives team promotes knowledge sharing and works to support students in achieving their academic, work, and life goals at the college. Throughout the year, we curate events, teachings, and workshops to promote understanding and appreciation of Indigenous cultures. This special event, Indigeneity and Disability, Perspectives on Education and Accessibility, will explore the intersections of identity, ability, and education through an Indigenous lens. This is an opportunity to engage in thought-provoking conversations about the challenges and innovations in making education more inclusive and accessible for all. Hear firsthand from Indigenous voices, specifically Denise today, and gain new insights on bridging the gaps in education equality. Your presence today is valuable, whether you're an educator, ally, or community member. This session will begin by the Indigenous Initiatives team asking several questions to Denise to learn from Denise, and then we'll have an opportunity to have an open discussion, allowing all participants and attendees to participate, ask questions, share their thoughts and experiences, and engage with Denise. I'd also like to go over a few things with the Zoom today. So you'll notice that there is a chat. At any point, please feel free to hold on to questions. There will be an open question period at the end of the conversation today, where you'll be able to have that open conversation with one another, with Denise, with the team, and we can think about ways to move forward in a meaningful way with this specific topic. You'll see that we have 2 ASL interpreters here with us today. We have Monique and Joanne. And today's session will also be recorded so that we can share it with others who are not able to join us with us during this time. At any point, if you have questions about the Zoom, how to use the question period, any details about the actual meeting itself, please feel free to message myself, and I'm happy to answer those questions throughout the meeting. This will take the style of a fireside chat. So it's really about having that conversation, really about engaging with one another and learning from somebody who has done a lot of community work, who is a member of the George Brown community. And on that, I would love to warmly welcome Denise Mcleod, who will now share an introduction of themselves before the first questions are asked. So welcome, Denise. Thank you so much for being here. Happy Wednesday to you. And I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself and who you are.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to start in the way that I best know how and I've been taught. So, Bojo, Gwenanong and Nukwe Indigenous Megazanadotum, Sagamakandanjaba, Tikaranto and Dunji, Anishinaabe and Dow, Nijik Manadoa Gandao. For folks who don't speak Anishinaabe Moin, I introduced myself in the language, and when I came home into community, the first thing that I was taught was to learn how to introduce yourself in the language so that the ancestors know that you're still here, that we're still here as Anishinaabe people. And so I was introducing myself in my Indigenous name, my spirit name, and clan, and where I'm from and where I live. And so that's what that is. And then a little bit about who I am. So my name is Denise B. Mcleod, or Denise Booth Mcleod. I am an alumni of George Brown College. I graduated in 2006. And also, please excuse me, I lost my voice. I was losing my voice on Monday, and then I went to the Premier's Awards, and I did not know how rowdy it got. And so when we were all cheering and um, cheering for George Brown, I lost my voice and actually couldn't speak at all yesterday, and so uh, I'm glad to have a voice today, actually, but it's a bit scratchy, so please excuse me. Um, I graduated from the Assaulted Women and Children's Counselor and Advocate program in 2006, and my career itself, it was a real honor to be asked to speak today about Indigeneity and disability. I will say that I certainly don't self-proclaim to be expert on disability or access. I can speak to it through my own lived experience and through traditional teachings, and so the work that I've done as within the last 20 years of doing this work. So I started my career uh, working specifically. I actually went to the UK and worked in the UK for a bit with folks with intellectual disabilities. And then when I came home, I specifically worked in Indigenous community, Toronto Indigenous community, for a really long time. Um, Worked at all the many, well, not all, but many of the organizations in Toronto, and then um, started teaching at George Brown in 2015, specifically in the Assaulted Women and Children's Counselor and Advocate program. So that was a really beautiful, like, full circle moment that I got to support the next generation of counselor and advocates. And I also worked at a place called the Toronto Birth Center, which is a third option to give birth when you are pregnant and in care with a midwife. And there are only 3 birth centers all across Ontario, which is a shame. There should be more, side note. But I work specifically around Indigenous cultural safety, race-based data collection, and creating accessible spaces for pregnant folks, pregnant people. And then over the last 2 years, I made the jump to be more corporate. And so I worked at the Toronto Transit Commission, um, first as the racial equity education consultant, um, and then at and then at I've just moved to, so sorry, I just moved to um, I just made the jump. Sorry, my whole brain just got lost. Um, uh, I just made the move to Metrolinx, and so I now hold the title of Senior Manager for Indigenous Relations for the Indigenous Relations Office for Metrolinx. And my portfolio largely, again, continues to look at education and like education and campaigns. So specifically Indigenous awareness campaigns. Uh, and notably, the Indigenous awareness campaign that, or sorry, for the TTC for 2022 or 23 and 2024, I was the project lead. I coordinated, I managed the Indigenous Peoples Month um, campaigns for the TTC. So everything that you saw on the TTC, the bus wraps, the streetcar wraps, the renaming of uh, 4 subway stations. I coordinated. I led that. I think, and beyond that, beyond my professional, fancy, blah blah blah, uh, I'm a mom of 2 grown-up humans. One of them is a student at George Brown College, so really excited to have like the next generation of my family be able to also attend George Brown. And, um, mom, spouse, dog mom, all of those things.
Thank you, Denise, for the introduction. And I'm so happy to have you here, and especially, considering all the amazing work that you've done and the work that you've done at George Brown and being part of the George Brown community. And I think it's so important to have people who have been in this community, who have, engaged with other professors, have been a professor, have taught, to have these conversations, these important conversations. So this month, November, is Indigenous Disability Awareness Month. So that is, what's really guiding this conversation today. And I think it's important to recognize that these are conversations that need to happen every month. And I think it's a topic and it's a discussion that needs to continue and grow and learn from one another, to unlearn, and then to see what we're doing and what we need to do to make a path forward that's inclusive for all individuals. So with that said, I'd love to learn a little bit more about specifically at George Brown. Before we go into the first session question, with your experience at George Brown, what the program, how long were you there for, and a little bit of context of when you were at George Brown as in that context.
As a professor, as a student?
As a student, I'd love
Oh,
to hear. Yes.
oh gosh. As a student, um, I was a pretty young mom. I was thinking about this on Monday. So not to, it always feels weird. So I was nominated for a Premier's Award for George Brown. I didn't win. Honored to be nominated, but I was, they say write an acceptance speech just in case, And I was thinking about that time that I was at George Brown, or even when I applied to George Brown. And so I applied. I was a young mom, pregnant with my second child. I was just turned 22, and so strange. And I was going to a parent, like a mom's group, because that's what they were called back then, a mom's group at the Jane and Finch Community and Family Center. And Tanya Lohr, who still works there, because I reached out a couple of months ago. Tanya Lohr is a graduate, also a graduate of George Brown College, of the AWCCA program, and she handed me a brochure, because that's how long it was ago that I got a paper brochure that talked about the AWCCA program, and she just said, I think you might benefit from this program. And I looked at it and thought, you know what, I'm going to apply. Like, young mom, I'm on social assistance, I'm not, I need to find a way to get more education, or further further my career, or figure out what I want to do with my life. um, you know Unlike most folks in their early 20s who are getting to figure out what they want to do with their life, I was raising a kid. I was raising a small child. um, and so I applied, and I was heavily pregnant. And at that time, a long time ago, for folks who are quite young, we used to have to come in person to everything. And so a long time ago, they had these in-person sort of interview sessions. And I was really heavily pregnant. I was probably about 8 months pregnant. And I had to go to this interview to get into the program. Um, I wrote an essay about why I would like to be in this program. And then they called me in for an interview, and I was heavily pregnant and sitting in this room with, the coordinator of the program at the time, and all of these other folks who were also wanting to be in this program. And thought, I walked out of that interview because I really didn't know anything about anything. Like, the questions were like, what's your favorite feminist? Who's your favorite feminist? And I was like, I don't know. What's a feminist? Like, I don't know what you're talking about. And it really, and so I walked out of the program, or walked out of that interview thinking like, oh, I'm never going to get into this. Uh, didn't do well in high school, wasn't a very good student, really struggled with academia, and and then we and then the week, so my daughter was born on April 21st, and I came home on April 24th. And on April 24th, when I got home with car seat and a brand new baby, and picking up my other daughter from her grandmother's house, got home and I found all my mail. And in my mail, in my big stack of mail, was the big envelope from George Brown College. And 20 years ago, getting a big envelope meant that you got into school because you got a big envelope or a small envelope. And so I got the big envelope and I was carrying my daughter like in her car seat and I almost dropped the car seat. I was so excited and shocked. But she was brand new and it was for September of that year. And so I made the decision to um, start school when my daughter was quite young. She was 5 months old. And so my college experience was quite different than a lot of folks and very similar to many people, especially George Brown, because it's such a diverse age place that, there were folks that were really young, and then there were also folks that, were new parents and struggling, just like me. And the, I, I know it sounds very dramatic, uh, but that program changed my life. Um, and the fact that like I learned all these concepts and these ideas that I learned the words for them. I learned what I was feeling was real, and that we talked about the systems of oppression and racism and misogyny and sexism and all these big words that I had no idea what they meant until we learned them. And I was like, oh, that's how I feel. That's how I that's how I exist in the world. And I the Assaulted Women and Children's Counselor and Advocate program is 2 years long. And, I have two small children. My eldest was starting kindergarten as I was starting school, which is also so very interesting to me because my eldest daughter, Rivers, and I have, always sort of been in school together, which is very interesting to me. Uh, she's almost 23. Anyways, and they would often, because of childcare and because of lots of different things, I often would have to bring them into school with me. And uh, George Brown, like especially the AWCCA program, because it was specifically for, working with survivors of violence and working with families and working with children, they were very accepting and welcoming to have children come to class with you. And so my kids, I hear my kids say, like, talk about these concepts that when I was their age, I had very little to no idea what they're talking about. And I was like, you're so smart. You're so brilliant. Like, oh my gosh, it's the internet. And then I realized that no, 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 they've literally been listening to this since they were babies. And so they know these ideas and these concepts very, even better than I do, because this has been their whole life, is listening to their mom talk about anti-oppression, anti-oppression work. And and also, in a way, it was a very Indigenous way of knowing and being, is to bring your children with you, right? Like to bring your family with you so that they're also learning and participating in community. Uh the AW, like, I love that program. I have so much love for that program and for all of the professors and folks who are involved in the program, because it gives, even if you never, like, I now do something entirely different than, being working with people who are survivors or experiencing gender-based violence. As a counselor and advocate, I use those skills that I learned almost 20 years ago, which is, I feel very old. Almost 20 years ago, I still use those skills in the anti-oppression work that I do, in the like Indigenous in the Office of Indigenous Relations, I'm still advocating, I'm still counseling in a very different way than what I originally set out that I thought I was going to do. I was going to change the world and I was going to end lots of things. Um, and I'm still using those skills in ways that uh, look different but are transferable. So, like George Brown in general gives you those skills to be marketable in any career that you go into.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, thank you. So I'd love to ask Kara, we have another question that we will ask. And I would love to ask Kara to bring up question number 2, please.
Hi, Denise. Welcome.
Kara,
Thank you for sharing so far.
thanks so much.
The question is, what has your experience been like in education? I know it's pretty broad, but I guess whatever stands out to you.
Thank you. I think when we think about education, we think of very Western institutions. And when I think about education, I largely think about how I wasn't very successful in education, in college, like in primary, like in public school, like when I was, in the elementary, secondary school years, I wasn't very successful. I often was told that I wasn't very smart or I wasn't going to achieve very much because I didn't have good grades. And I remember once in high school, I wanted to take a bunch of it because, again, I went to school 100 years ago to some of the folks here. But in the 90s, when you were in high school, you had advanced, general, or basic. That was the streams you were sort of lumped into. And I wanted to take some advanced classes, and the guidance counselor, I remember the guidance counselor actively encouraging me not to take advanced classes, like, oh, you only need those if you're going to go to university, like just take general classes, like you're not, it wasn't, university was never encouraged. I grew up in a pretty working class uh, home, fairly, not well to do. And, I was taught that, like, you go to school to get a job. You don't go to school to learn. Like, I only learned that over the last 10 years, that you could go to school to learn, just to learn, which I thought was just a really mind blowing concept to me. Like, what do you mean you just go to school to learn the things you're interested in? That doesn't even make sense to me. And I really struggled with reading comprehension, and I was one of those young girls that was very daydreamy and was constantly, I talk too much and I make too much noise, uh, and it wasn't until very recently, about 2 years ago, that I got diagnosed with ADHD. Uh, which makes so much sense. Like, once I got this diagnosis, I was like, wait a minute, wait one gosh darn minute. Like, all of my education made so much sense. Like, my educational experience made so much sense to me because I was like, oh, I'm not dumb. I just didn't learn the way you wanted me to learn. And when we think about, especially Indigenous folks or marginalized people and, intergenerational trauma, and the Western institutions aren't made for us. Like, they're not made for us to be successful. And so um, I started, finished at George Brown and didn't really think about going back to school. I was like, oh, I kind of toyed with the idea. I wanted to be a midwife for a really long time because I really wanted to support families especially Indigenous families, to bring their children into the world in ways that felt good and positive and culturally safe. And then I started going to school to become a midwife with undiagnosed ADHD and had to learn how a pancreas works. I don't care. It didn't, I wasn't successful. I will openly admit that. Like that just biology and uh like sciences don't, I'm not quite interested in them. So they didn't, so I didn't finish that. I didn't finish the goal of being a midwife, but worked in midwifery, worked with midwives, did amazing, like did a lot of the work that I actually wanted to do that I thought you needed to go to school for, like Western education institution school. Uh, and then one day, a friend of mine was like, "Hey, because I noticed that I couldn't sort of move up in my career because I didn't have the right education. Like I had college and I did fairly well in college, like nothing, you know, nothing exciting. Didn't get on the dean's list or anything, but I did all right. I knew what I was learning. I, passed everything. Um, but I had a friend who was like, "Have you thought of um, going into the graduate program of urban Indigenous education at York University?" And I was like, "Well, I don't have a bachelor's because, we're taught these things like you do this thing. It's all very linear and it's all very like you have to get a bachelor's before you get a master's and then you blah, blah, blah." And, but I was teaching at George Brown at the time, which was so funny. Like I was teaching um, in the AWCCA program you know, um, with no master, like with no graduate degree, no bachelor's degree. And they're like, "Well, you're doing the work. Like you're doing urban Indigenous education." And then I learned that like you can apply with lived work, like with experience that's not just education, like lived experience, work experience, proving that you can do that. And so I applied to a graduate program. I got into the graduate program. I just finished the graduate program. It took me a very long time to finish the graduate program. It took me 7 years to do, to get through a master's, which is, I find it very amusing. But I did very well in school. Like I did very well in this graduate program. Like I got my average is like an A plus. And I was like, what's happening? Like I was told I was dumb my whole life. Like I told that I wasn't ever going to, be successful in academia. And then, getting this graduate degree, which I, getting a graduate degree, being a very successful professor, like I really love teaching. I love teaching the students. I loved all of the because I started in the AWCCA program and then moved to community worker program and the child and youth care program CYC program, and was teaching Indigenous studies. And so I got to really create classes that I would find interesting. I largely created classes that I was like, how do I teach this content that's quite heavy in ways that I find interesting, that isn't just focusing on these deficiencies. And so education, it's so funny for someone who has never been, quote like successful in education to now define themselves as an educator. Like I've spent, the last decade of my life educating people, not only in educational institutions, but also within community, being facilitator, going to different communities to support their work around gender-based violence and anti-oppression work. So it's education is such a interesting. I have a very interesting relationship with it.
Thank you so much, Denise. And I know the beginning of our chat today is very if you need a break at all, feel free to take one. I know you're doing amazing. We're so happy that you're here. And I just want to comment that again, I think it's so important that you've been through both the student component and the teaching piece, and now sharing that your children are going through it as well. I think it must be so unique to see it through their eyes and see what has changed or what hasn't changed. And I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about that. What's still in effect, whether that be policies, procedures in education, and what things need to be looked at in a different way. I'd like to now invite Jolene, who is also a part of the Indigenous Initiatives team, to ask the next question.
Hi, Denise. Yes, I know Denise from the community and from George Brown. Welcome. Thank you for sharing with us. My question is, what impacts would creating culturally safe spaces and validating Indigenous knowledges and experience have on education?
So the thing I noticed about, thanks, Jolene. It's good to see you.
You too.
I haven't seen you in a long time. I do miss, I miss teaching, and I largely miss going up to the 4th floor to see all of you. Just to get coffee and to see what you're all doing. Yeah. So, there's in education specifically, and I know it's like in all sectors and institutions, that we're talking about like reconciliation, and what does reconciliation look like, and how do we reconcile, the history of, the two histories that are Canada, like the Canadian history and the Indigenous history of how we all came to be together. And we talk about a lot, about reconciliation, and it's still in a very institutional way. Like, we still talk about it in this way that, is a checkbox. And, reconciliation is incredibly important. Fulfilling the calls to action and the calls for justice are needed. Those are very much needed. And I know that, especially in the West, people like tasks. They like tangible tasks that they can do to come to the end goal. And if you think about reconciling or even creating cultural safety, these ideas are Indigenous. Like well, reconciliation is an English word, and we're using this as a term to talk about, reconciling with Indigenous folks, or, Canadians and Indigenous people reconciling with each other. It's still very checkbox. And the thing that it's very well-meaning. It is very frustrating to just have like, oh, we've done this training, check, in places that I have worked or continue to work, they're still talking about Indigenous awareness. But I'm Indigenous. Are you aware now? Like, it's so frustrating to think that we haven't moved on to how do we create spaces that are accessible to everyone, or as accessible as they can be, with the limitations of money and capitalism and all of those other things. How do we create space that is accessible? And I think about, like, well, what does truly accessible look like? I would love for things to be truly accessible, also knowing the limitations of funding, and which all goes back to like capitalism and systems of oppression. And, we would have a conversation about that. For me, when I was teaching, and every once in a while I'd get in trouble with the dean at the time. Well, not the dean, the chair of our department, because I refused to have exams. I hated exams. I was like, why do I need exams? Or, some of the legacy projects or ideas that are like projects, assignments, tests, especially for like Indigenous studies classes, that wasn't the point of the Indigenous studies class. Like, if intro to Indigenous studies, sure, fine, we'll do a test. I think that's ridiculous that, you just have to study. But classes like urban Indigenous education, what was the class called? Urban Indigenous Perspectives on Community Work. It was a very long time ago. And then there was another class that I taught called Canada's First People. And these classes, all of these classes, what happened was all of the classes in the syllabuses that I got initially were, this week is about residential school, this week is about murder missing Indigenous women, this week is about treaties, this week is about blah blah blah. And it largely focused on deficiency models. And I'm not like, when I complain about this, it's not that I don't believe that we as a community, George Brown, Canadians, Indigenous people, it's not that I don't believe that we don't need to have these conversations, because we do. But what happens is that it feeds into the narrative that Indigenous people lack something, that we are deficient in the ability to care for ourselves, which is entirely untrue. And so when I'm no way am I like, I'm the greatest teacher in the world. Well, maybe a little bit, but like, no way am I saying I'm the greatest teacher in the world. But I really wanted the students, I would often say to the students, like, I don't want to hear you, I don't want 24 essays of you regurgitating what I've told you. If I wanted to hear the sound of my own voice, I would just record the lectures. And I often joke, like, as a professor, like, I'm a professor because I love the sound of my own voice. But I wanted to hear how they took in the knowledge and how they're going to put this knowledge into their practice as child and youth workers, community workers, social service workers. That it's all well and good to learn about residential schools. What are you going to do with that information? How are you going to work with survivors of, or the ancestors of the survivors of residential school? How are you doing this? At one point I was teaching like 5 days a week, largely Indigenous content, and 5 days a week talking about residential school, murder missing Indigenous women, environmental discrepancies, health discrepancies. It's hard. It's hard to, like, my family has lived through this. I have lived through this. These are stories and understandings of what I know as an Indigenous person. And so it really started to, like, take a toll on my own mental health. And so as much as you need to learn about these really important topics, you also need to see that Indigenous people are thriving. That, we are leaders in art, music, fashion, food, whatever. And so I would the final project for most of my Indigenous studies classes were, what are you interested in? Go find the Indigenous version of that and tell me about it. I've had students make bannock or fry bread and bring it into class. I've had students make children's books with the language and talk about how they're going to put it into their practice. And so that very long ramble was to talk about examples of creating culturally safe spaces. That, in education, we talk about due dates and everything has a due date. And I would often get in trouble for this as well. But I never, there were due dates because it had to be in the syllabus. But I was largely like, just when can you get it into me? Which also was very hard for me as an educator, because I was marking mostly, during my reading weeks or during, winter holidays to get to submit grades on time. And so, you know, but creating culturally safe space for students is being flexible, and Western education is not flexible. And as well, like, to be able to, you know, the AWCCA program, when they first approached me to teach, I was like, you know, I don't have the education, right? You know, I don't have a bachelor's, I don't have a master's, like I can't teach. And, you know, at the time it was Mandy and Max, and they looked at me like I had three heads, and were like, but that's not the point of this program. And it was the first time that lived experience and work experience actually was validated in ways other than what institutions are looking for, which is education. And loads of people can get education. There's loads of, you know, folks who have graduate degrees and postgrads and doctorates and all of those things that, you know, struggle with the ability to teach in a way that's fulsome and accessible for folks. Like, you know, created slides. And even when I was teaching in person, I learned that Google Slides has closed captioning. So I was able to close caption my slides even when I was teaching in person. Once we got, you know, when 2020 happened and we had to all be in our homes, weirdly enough, it became more accessible in ways for folks who needed that, like needed closed captioning, or needed other means of teaching other than me just standing and talking at them for 3 hours, which I'd love to do. I'll happily do it. Like, you want me to talk at you for 3 hours, like, but how do we do that in ways that are a bit more fulsome?
Thank you, Denise. And before we go into the next question that Shanice will ask, I wanted to, just in case folks were not aware, I just want to share a little bit of information about Indigenous Disability Awareness Month, and just kind of connect it to a lot of the things that you're talking about. And it's so important to hear, again, firsthand your experiences, both as a student, as an educator. So the Indigenous Disability Awareness Month is observed annually as a month dedicated to recognizing and celebrating the contributions, resilience, and achievements of Indigenous peoples with disabilities. And I really am happy that you mentioned, or you discussed how we need to move away from the deficit approach. And that's so important. So celebrating uniqueness, celebrating contributions, celebrating the resilience and achievements. This month also aims to raise awareness about the unique barriers and challenges faced while advocating for inclusion and accessibility within Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. So some of the key themes for this month, and again, it's not just about a month, but it's all year. We need to acknowledge, celebrate, and support. And some of the key themes that have come across is, and I'll touch on all of them a little bit, is acknowledging intersectionality. So Indigenous peoples with disabilities often experience compounded challenges due to intersection of ableism, racism, systemic inequities. We need to highlight those issues and encourage actions to address all of these intersections. And then the theme of promoting awareness. So again, this month, not just this month, but always we need to talk about how do we educate individuals about the prevalence of the barriers and challenges that still exist today. And you mentioned the checklist approach, and that's something that I've seen in many different sectors, whether it be post-secondary, government, nonprofit, that checklist piece. How do we move away from the checklist approach and actually start to do the work, and embed that in all elements? And when institutions, say they'll do the thing, how do we actually do the thing, and then have that accountability piece to it? And then you mentioned celebrating resilience and achievement. So honoring the strengths and contributions of Indigenous peoples in various fields, whether it's from arts, education, community leadership, and then the advocating for accessibility and equity. So fostering discussions on creating inclusive policies, services, and environments that respect the rights and dignity of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples with disabilities. So I'm going to ask Shanice, who is the newest member to Indigenous Initiatives and is the mentorship program lead. Shanice has the fourth question.
Hi, Denise. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
My question for you is, how do educational institutions incorporate reconciliation and disability justice?
Mm. You know, it's such a good question, and it's so, and when we take that intersectional approach of understanding that everyone lives with privilege and oppression, that when we create space for one, we create space for all. I in my work, actually in my work in transit, weirdly enough, I had to talk about this often to folks who just were not interested. Not because you know, not because they were malicious or things like that, just because they didn't quite understand, you know, how to do something not in this Western way of checking a box, but in a when we think about a buzzword like a meaningful consultation or a meaningful engagement or meaningful, this idea of meaningful, put in whatever, meaningful reconciliation. You know, uh, when we think about this, or like in institutions and governmental sectors, it is still very much based on this Western approach, and not understanding, you know, that when we create space for one, we're creating space for all. There's a very fancy academic term called targeted universalism. I was like, and so in transit, we would often talk about this idea of targeted universalism. They love to talk about this targeted universalism, and we would talk about it in a way that, like, so streetcars, the old streetcars, we all remember. Many of us remember the old streetcars with the steps, and you know, in the winter they were icy, even when they weren't accessible to anybody. Uh, the people who were very able-bodied could do it, but by and large, most folks struggled with getting on and off the streetcar, especially if you had a mobility issue or any sort of physical disability. If you had a stroller, if you had bags, if anything. And so old streetcars, oh, we love them, they're so lovely, blah. But these new streetcars, we got these new streetcars so that they are accessible for folks with mobility devices or who have mobility issues. I like taking the new streetcars way more than the old ones, right? Like the new streetcars, if you have a bike or if you have groceries or if you have a stroller or if I struggle with, I have arthritis in my knees that's actually terrible for someone my age. The doctors keep saying you're too advanced for someone your age, and I was like, well, at least I'm advanced in something. So I struggle, especially in the winter, with mobility, and so I would avoid taking the streetcar at all costs when we had the old ones. We have these new ones, and there's a bit of a hike step up, but there's also the ramp that comes out, and so when people were finally mindful that not everybody can walk up 3 stairs, that it created, yes, now folks who use mobility devices or who have strollers or bikes can now get on the streetcar easily. so can all of us. I get excited now when I see a streetcar and it's, one of the new ones. And they have the stops. The stops are written out. They're called out. There's lots of different signifiers to tell you where you are. And so they did, the TTC did this to comply with ADOA standards. However, those streetcars are accessible for many of us now, not all, but many of us can use or have more access to the newer streetcars than the older ones. And same with like automatic doors. Automatic doors were created with people who had for mobility devices. During COVID, during a global pandemic, and nobody wanted to touch anything, your elbow could, push the button, or you wave your hand over the sensor and the doors would open. And so that reduced us touching things that were dirty. And so creating space looks, they did this to comply with ADOA standards, but it's improved all of our lives. Even if you don't use a mobility device or are living with a disability. And so when we think about these ideas of creating space, or creating, when disability justice and reconciliation, to me, and I, they're all a part of the same system. They're all like, we're all trying to fix the same problem, which is systemic oppression, which is, the white supremacist society, ableist, misogynist society that was created. These are all things that we need to do together. And also, like, Indigenous people, many Indigenous people, and I don't know if other Indigenous folks who do talks like this, if you get asked, like, well, what happened, in before colonization with people who were living with disabilities? Well, they were honored in our communities, and communities were made accessible for them. Like, it wasn't, they weren't shunned, they weren't put in, up until even still, people get put away. Like, if you don't fit into this box of, like, this is how you're supposed to be in the West, the way you look, your race, your gender, your class, your education, all of those things, if you don't fit into this box, then you're kind of pushed to the margins. In Indigenous culture, that never happened. Everybody was always incorporated into culture, into the community, and people were met where they were at. And so it is, I think I always sound, I kind of joke, like, I just sound like a person with a tinfoil hat. I'm like, it's about the government, man. Like, it's about, changing systems. It's about breaking down the systemic oppression that is upheld and valued still within our society. Many of us were taught that we had to go to post-secondary school. And if when I was a kid, when I was in high school, get into computers, man, that's the way of the future, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to have any need for skilled trades. Well, 20 something, no, 30 years later, I was like, how old am I? 30 years later, after I've graduated high school, we now have a lack of skilled trades because it wasn't valued. Skilled trades were, this elitist classes, like, oh, we don't need skilled trades. They're unimportant. Well, now we have a lack of them. Or become a doctor. Everyone should become a doctor, instead of, we need nurses and technicians and all of the things. So there's still this very elitist, like, if you're going to work in this field, do get the most education that you can, like, to be the doctor, the lawyer, the engineer, the IT, those things, instead of really encouraging people to like find out what they're interested in, and not pushing kids. And I've said this for a really long time, even when I was in high school. How am I supposed to know at 17 what I want to do for the rest of my life? You want me to buckle down with like 40 grand worth of OSAP debt because my family doesn't have money to send me to school. So I have all this OSAP debt. And because I'm non-status and live off reserve and all of those things, I wouldn't get funding through my community. To what end? And so we have to look at, creating other learning pathways, other ways to, validate knowledge, to gain knowledge, to have folks excel in things that they're interested in. Again, I said it earlier, like, I didn't know that you could just go to school. You only went to school to find a job. And, I remember, I think I was maybe interested in like going to university for like women's studies or something. Again, still the 90s. And my dad looked at me and said, well, why would you do that? Like, what job are you going to get with that? What job are you going to get with a women's studies degree? Go be a nurse. Go be a nurse. I would love to work in healthcare, like frontline direct, like with folks. I do not like bodily fluids. So I'm not going to be a nurse because that's not how I get, I'm not going to be able to support people to, and so how do we encourage people to learn and to continue to learn and to get out of that linear, once you're done high school, you have to go to post-secondary school. And once you're done post-secondary school, you either go on to further post-secondary school or you go out and work. And there is a push for skilled trades, but it's still not considered, like, it's still, as much as Canada loves to say that we're not, we don't have a class divide, it's still very classist. It's still like, we're still very elitist. Like, we still hold these ideas and notions of what good education is, or what the best kind of education is, like you going to university as opposed to going to college, or going to this university instead of going to this university, or going to this college. It's not created, like, it's not equitable. It's still a part of that problem, or that issue of not creating equitable spaces.
Thank you so much, Denise. And I'd love to take a moment for everyone in the virtual room to think about any questions that they would like to ask Denise. And in the chat, I did
just need to step away for 2 seconds.
Yeah, no, that's no problem. So in the chat, I did add the bio that was attached to the Eventbrite invite, as well as a little bit about that session. And it doesn't have to be specifically, maybe it's just a conversation that you want to have, and maybe it's that more of a dialogue that we all have together, or a question specifically for Denise. So if you'd like to use the chat function, that's absolutely great. So feel free to type in the chat. If you prefer to unmute and raise your hand, we can also do that. And also feel free at this point, if you are comfortable putting on the videos, and we'll all, if you're comfortable with that, we'll engage in that conversation. So take a moment if you need to. The chat is open, and I'd love to just open the floor. And Denise, if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, please.
Awesome. And I did put this in the chat as well, but all those, who ask questions and just for engaging, we are going to have a little draw for a few books by Indigenous authors. So that will also be available after our session. So we have a first question by Anita. Knowing that there are no easy answers and that we are all on the journey, What is one additional significant thing that you feel that we can do to make students feel safe, included, and supported in virtual and physical classes?
There is no one easy answer, and everyone is everyone has their own needs, and especially as as educators, and you intersect that with, are you full-time, are you part-time, are you contract? There's to create space for students in ways that are safer, more accessible, you know, um, is a lot. And it is, as much as I complain about capitalism, like part-time and contract educators are doing a lot of free work, doing a lot of free labor to ensure that their students are getting the best education, largely because they educators love it. Like, they love to be able to teach. For me, it was a lot of like learning, like a lot of, as I was teaching these classes, like, oh, this worked, this didn't work. Uh, Asking students, like, what do you need to be able to be successful? And so things like, you know, uh, having to read a book, like reading a chapter, reading books. I stopped asking for textbooks. Like, I stopped requiring textbooks, and so would often try to get as many free resources that I could, so students didn't have to, pay for the textbook that maybe we were going to use like 3 chapters from. And then, especially for classes like Indigenous Studies, there's not one textbook that is fulsome, perfect, accessible, all of those things. And so there were a lot of, I had lots of different other methods of disseminating knowledge to students. So, would would take the chapter that I was allowed to use in a textbook and scan it and put it online. Podcasts, especially with reading, and reading is really hard. Like, reading can be difficult for folks. Is this an audiobook? Can you like, how can we get this to you in other ways? There, in one of my classes originally, there was like, read some this textbook, this chapter on this specific topic. I think it was about residential schools, or it was actually like, watch We Were Children, this wonderful and incredibly hard movie to watch about survivors of residential school. And I would put it on the syllabus. But after, the first 7 weeks of hearing about trauma and colonization and all of these things, I'm like, your midterm project is to like read a book, but listen to the audiobook, find a podcast. If you want to read a book, and it had to be fiction. I didn't want a nonfiction book. I'm like, I want you to read something pleasurable that is written by an Indigenous author in a genre that you would like to read. Because also, students are not reading for pleasure. They're reading to get their grades and do this thing. So I'm going to give you this one little like reprieve, that you're going to read something that you want to read. And then the other sort of major assignment was, I want you to consume some sort of media, Indigenous media. I don't care what it is. Something created by an Indigenous person. It could be a TV show, it could be a movie, it could be a comic book, it could be whatever. Go to an Indigenous event, depending on what semester I was teaching, fall or winter. Lots of great Indigenous events that happen. There was Imaginative that happened in October, and there was, so there's lots of ways to create space for students. I really wanted them to start learning how to critically think. And while we do teach students how to critically think, it's in a very specific way. Like, I want you to critically think about what you are consuming. How the thing that you are consuming that is created by an Indigenous person, how does it differ from the content or the media or the books or whatever that you read about Indigenous people that are created about non-Indigenous people, or that are created by non-Indigenous people? What does that look like? And so, and it went beyond write me a paper, read a book, write me a paper. Yeah, you could do that. That could be easy. You could read a book and write a paper. Make it, and because students really love to know this, like 2 to 3 pages, blah, 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 margins, blah, 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 font type, all of those things. Or you could create an art piece, or you could write or like create something else. You can create something else, whatever else, whatever other thing you want to create. It doesn't have to be a written essay, because, especially in education, you consume a thing and you write an essay about it. Well, not everybody's not everybody can write. Yes, we have chat GPT, blah, blah, blah. I was teaching before all of those, or what I know them to be, exist, and so I was like, geez, I wanted students to be successful in ways that were accessible, like that they felt success, like that they were interested in, that they wanted to learn, that they were engaged in, and to highlight what they're good at. I had a student like knit their project. I had another student write a song. I had another student do spoken word. Another student create a video. So there's so many other ways that students are able to learn, like self-reflect on that learning and give that back to you as an educator, that we can mark. Because I know that, as much as I'm like, oh, blah, test, and it wasn't Dead Poet Society in my classrooms or anything like that. It was like, I still need to mark you on something. Like, we're still confounded in this institution that you need a grade, and it can't be arbitrary, and I have to prove that you've earned this grade, because that's how institutions work. Well, you're going to give me something that you're proud of, and I'm going to mark it. And also, I wouldn't mark on things like grammar and spelling. And I know people have lots of feelings about that, because I really struggled with grammar and spelling. I still do. I wanted to see what their content was. How are they processing their information? And the best essays I ever read were not, they weren't copy edited. They had lots of spelling, grammar mistakes, but they knew how to. They really understood how to take this information and apply it to the work they were doing, and that was what was most important.
Thank you, Denise. And Anita says they would love to have you as an educator. Thank you. Thank you. Ren, I see your virtual hand up. Thank you.
I'm not sure that I can properly, I've been trying to write it out and I'm like, I can't fix it properly, but I guess this may be a little difficult to navigate. But I guess knowing that we're working, living, learning within these institutions that really do prioritize, make decisions based on, did you meet the checklist? Did you do everything per the strategic plan and all of that? what, I guess, opportunities, successes, places for innovation have you found that really do make that space for like learners who have been told you don't fit, you can't succeed, or people in the workplace the same, to be able to actually feel at home and be in a space where they belong, where like things like, oh, spelling or grammar are not going to get them docked marks or performance, and like actually move to that the more holistic, justice oriented sense of change instead of just, well, we did the checklist, everyone's now aware because we provided training. And I know that might not be a question you can answer, but I'm curious what you've seen.
Thank you so much, Ren. I agree with you that, I never understood so when I first started working in DEI, in this like very corporate way, I I initially was like, I don't know why you hired me. Like, I don't work in DEI. And my manager at the time said, "You've been doing this your whole life. Like, what are you talking about?" And then I realized that, there's a very corporate understanding. Uh, Megan, can you turn off your mic? Thank you. Um, we have this very like it's a very like narrow, linear understanding that of education, of how to apply learning, uh, how to do these things, and I don't. I honestly don't believe that I am the answers. Like I don't have all the answers. There are far smarter people than I who are doing way cooler work than me. Um, I, you know, would be like, well, how do we do this? I'm like, have you talked to the people? Have you talked to anybody? Did you talk to anybody who's living with a disability? Have you talked to anybody who is marginalized in the way that you're trying to learn about marginalization? Have you talked to these people? Do you have these people working in this, in these spaces? So what often happens is like very well-meaning people who might have some, lived experience around marginalization take up these very big roles in corporate culture around DEI. I'm sorry, my dog is barking if you hear it. He is outside and he's mad that he is now outside and nobody's outside with him. I'm so sorry. Uh, and so you know, people without lived experience are taking up roles to create equity lenses, but not for we how we create like how to create space, how to create equitable opportunities. They don't like when I first started at certain places, I'm like, have you I was the first indigenous I was the first indigenous like person to when I first started at the TTC. No shit. I'm not. There's no tea. Not talking. No, no. Um, when I first started at the TTC, uh, as the racial equity education consultant, I have a master's in education. I have taught, anti-oppression, feminist, anti-racist education for, you know, almost a decade. And when I would walk in, people were like, "Oh, you're the new Indigenous consultant." Nope, no, I'm the education consultant. And initially, because I was raised, I'm very Canadian. A lot of the times, I was very polite about. It. I'm like, actually, no, 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 no. I'm the education consultant. And then after month 3, so it's like, "Oh, you're the Indigenous consultant." I was like, that any organization across and through any organization can hire more than one indigenous person at any given time. And then I was accused of being mean to people, but you know, these ideas around people don't understand, like when we talk about microaggressions, when we talk about, you know, these ideas around creating inclusive workspaces, we're still doing it out of this like awareness competency model that, you know, all people with who use, you know, mobility devices all have this experience. All, you know, when I was in school, we talked about cross cultural communications, uh, which sort of opened the door to around like this idea of like how do we engage with people who are not of your like who do not share your same lived experience. But there's still a deficiency in that because it was still like all Japanese people do this, all Indigenous people do this, all, you know, all uh you know, all people of this specific marginalization do this without really understanding intersectionality, that, you know, I am a, you know, Anishinaabe woman, and, you know, sure, some of those cultural understandings might be similar to Jolene or Jess or, you know, other Indigenous staff at George Brown, but we also have very different lived experiences. Like I grew up in the city. I was a part of the 60 scoop. I was raised by non-Indigenous people. I did not grow up in my culture. I did not, you know, I've never, you know, up until my mid 20s, I'd never set foot on a reserve. Like, you know, all of these things. So all Indigenous people do this is incorrect. So this idea of like, and it creates more microaggressions because then you're like, oh, I learned about you. All people do this. Your type of people do this, but it also feeds into that like racist, oppressive narrative in a very well-meaning way. You know, like, oh, well, this, you know, I hope I answered your question. I don't know.
No, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for the questions, and Denise for your responses. I just wanted to check if there's any other questions that folks would like to ask. We probably have time for one more. Any others? And we'll keep that open to the chat, or you can put your hand up. But if there are no other questions, I wanted to, I guess my question to you, Denise, is, do you have questions for those who are in attendance today? And that not to answer, but just for them to start thinking about, because I think it's so important to walk away from these conversations and for folks to reflect on their own practices, their own, like whether they're educators, whether they're you know, an admin, whether they're in government and whatever their role is. What questions do they which questions should they start asking themselves, their organizations, their team? And I know we need another 6 hours for to talk about that, because there's so many, you know, questions for people to ask themselves and ask their organizations. But are there any that stick out to you that you'd like to leave this group with, just reflection questions?
You know, there's a couple of things. One, when we're talking about creating space for XY marginalized group, where are they? Are they a part of this conversation? Are those people reflected in the work that is being done? Do you have people with lived experience working in DEI? And like diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, anti-racism, you know, I think people are now putting reconciliation on there. When you're doing anti-oppressive work, when you're creating anti-oppressive spaces, when you're creating anti-racist spaces, how, like, are the people that you're like, are those people there? Are they at the table? Are they, you know, are you engaging with them? And also what happens is, are you engaging with people and not just taking their knowledge? You know, how are you being reciprocal and giving back to those folks that you're engaging with to get their knowledge on how to be better. You know, for educational institutions, what are your hiring practices? Are you hiring people with lived experience to teach those in those programs, like in those topics? Are you hiring the people who have that experience? What are you using as mechanisms of, you know, in your hiring practices to like show that they are qualified to do the work? Are they just, not just, it's very hard to be educated. Someone who's been in, it's very hard to be educated as somebody who's marginalized. But are you using other methods of understanding, like other methods to qualify and quantify their knowledge and their ability to do their job? Are like how we talk about, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and yet the people who are in power largely don't look like me, don't look like most of the people on the call, I'm assuming. There's still the people in power have always been in power. And how are you mentoring people to take these leadership roles in ways that are holistic, that you're going to be successful, not in Western metrics, but in like, this person is learning, and maybe they're not going to take a leadership role in this institution, but they're going to go on and do something else. And also, how are you creating space to stop looking at deficiency models? Like education, I actively chose to work in social service. Like I actively, I'm going to work with my community. How do we create like a strength-based models? How are you, how are we pushing back against normal? Normal's such a annoying word anyways, but like, how are you pushing back against normal? Normal's boring. We need better, not normal people. Coded language for something else, but you know what I mean? Like, where are the other people? Where are they? Because if you don't, I often say, like, if you don't see the people that look like you, then you have to be the people that look like you. And I say that with a lot of privilege. Like I acknowledge that, I said, okay, I'm gonna be the first one to go to college, and I did, in my family. I'm gonna create a comedy, we're gonna create Indigenous comedy, and we did. I'm gonna create other Indigenous spaces and other things that there weren't historically Indigenous people, and I did. There's a lot of privilege in that. And not everybody has that access, like the ability to do that. But it's not just about checking we have the Indigenous people, and we have the disability services, and we have the 2S LGBT group, and we have the disability group, and how are all those groups coming together and working together to create education that is accessible for all? That's not just accessible for the folks who have always been able to take up space in very specific ways.
Denise, a million times thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm so grateful to have met you and be able to chat today. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us. I do want to be mindful of your time, but I will stay on if there's any others on the call, whoever would like to stay on and chat, or just leave some comments in the chat. We will share them all with you, Denise, and thank you. Thank you. And I hope to continue these conversations, and I hope that we will all be able to continue these conversations together.